Right, I'm going to continue my reading of this work, The Origin of Species. Unfortunately, the light's not very good. It's evening. I haven't got a very good camera, but what can we do? I feel like reading right now, so I hope that in the future, the moments when I feel like reading will land on more opportune times, for filming. But this is what we've got for now. So we've just read, in the last video, a historical sketch of the scholarly climate that was surrounding Darwin at the time of writing The Origin of Species. And I wanted to include that in the reading because as someone who lives, over 100 years after Darwin, I have received this idea, this theory of evolution quite easily. It's a very established theory by now. It's a theory that's easy to take for granted. And so it was very nice to be able to read, the respect that Darwin had for other scholars, especially Wallace, who basically stumbled on the same idea at the same time as Darwin, the younger scholar, as far as I know. But also all the people that came before Darwin's time who had already started propounding on the idea of evolution, or at least, evolution at least as gradual change. They could start to observe certain unavoidable facts about, for example, how difficult it could be to differentiate between different species. There was a kind of gradual distinction between varieties. And so all these things pointed, or the existence of two species which had kind of independently in different parts of the world assumed so similar a form. And I find it funny, in some of the sections it seemed almost like some of the scholars, I can't remember who, that they were saying, why would God, it's a lot of work to independently, create each species. At least that's how I read it. That, there's so much gradual variation between different varieties. There's quite a lot of work for a creator to kind of instantiate them separately without there being some process behind it. So it seemed that there was, for a long time in the works, a wealth of evidence out there suggesting a slightly different conception of the creation of life, and that things are and that there seems to be a connection between some species, between all species, that there was some relationality between them. And so that was quite interesting. I also particularly liked Darwin's expression of respect for these other scholars, and I'm sensing a certain level of modesty about ownership for these ideas. It's almost like the scientific endeavour is to him more important than the ownership of the ideas. At least that's how I'm reading it. Very good. What do you call it? Being a good sportsman, good sportsmanship. Yeah. Anyways, I'm going to read the introduction now to the actual book that follows that historical sketch that we just read. So, the introduction. When on board HMS Beagle as naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the inhabitants of South America, and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts seemed to me to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries, as it has been called by one of our greatest philosophers. On my return home, it occurred to me in 1837 that something might perhaps be made out on this question by patiently accumulating and reflecting on all sorts of facts which could possibly have any bearing upon it. After 5 years' work, I allowed myself to speculate on the subject and drew up some short notes. These I enlarged in 1844 into a sketch of the conclusions, which then seemed to me probable. From that period to the present day, I have steadily pursued the same object. I hope that I may be excused for entering on these personal details, as I give them to show that I have not been hasty in coming to a decision. My work is now nearly finished, but as it will take me 2 or 3 more years to complete it, and as my health is far from strong, I have been urged to publish this abstract. I have more especially been induced to do this as Mr. Wallace, who is now studying the natural history of the Malay archipelago, has arrived at almost exactly the same general conclusions that I have on the origin of species. Last year he sent to me a memoir on this subject, with a request that I would forward it to Sir Charles Lyell, who sent it to the Linnean Society, and it is published in the 3rd volume of the Journal of that Society. Sir C. Lyell and Dr. Hooker, who both knew of my work, the latter having read my sketch of 1844, honoured me by thinking it advisable to publish, with Mr. Wallace's excellent memoir, some brief extracts from my manuscripts. This abstract, which I now publish, must necessarily be imperfect. I cannot here give references and authorities for my several statements, and I must trust to the reader, reposing some confidence in my accuracy. No doubt errors will have crept in, though I hope I have always been cautious in trusting to good authorities alone. I can here give only the general conclusions at which I have arrived, with a few facts in illustration, but which, I hope, in most cases will suffice. No one can feel more sensible than I do of the necessity of hereafter publishing in detail all the facts with references on which my conclusions have been grounded, and I hope in a future work to do this. For I am well aware that scarcely a single point is discussed in this volume on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those at which I have arrived. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question, and this cannot possibly be here done. I much regret that want of space prevents my having the satisfaction of acknowledging the generous assistance which I have received from the very many naturalists, some of them personally unknown to me. I cannot, however, let this opportunity pass without expressing my deep obligations to Dr. Hooker, who for the last 15 years has aided me in every possible way by his large stores of knowledge and his excellent judgment. In considering the origin of species, it is quite conceivable that a naturalist, reflecting on the mutual affinities of organic beings, on their embryological relations, their geographical distribution, geological succession, and other such facts, might come to the conclusion that each species had not been independently created, but had descended like varieties from other species. Nevertheless, such a conclusion, even if well-founded, would be unsatisfactory until it could be shown how the innumerable species inhabiting this world have been modified so as to acquire that perfection of structure and co-adaptation which most justly excites our admiration. Naturalists continually refer to external conditions such as climate, food, etc., as the only possible cause of variation. In one very limited sense, as we shall hereafter see, this may be true. but it is preposterous to attribute to mere external conditions the structure, for instance, of the woodpecker, with its feet, tail, beak and tongue, so admirably adapted to catch insects under the bark of trees. In the case of the mistletoe, which draws its nourishment from certain trees, which has seeds that must be transported by certain birds, and which has flowers with separate sexes, absolutely requiring the agency of certain insects to bring pollen from one flower to the other, it is equally preposterous to account for the structure of this parasite, with its relations to several distinct organic beings, by the effects of external conditions, or of habit, or of the volition of the plant itself. The author of the Vestiges of Creation would, I presume, say that after a certain unknown number of generations, some bird had given birth to a woodpecker, and some plant to the mistletoe, and that these had been produced perfect as we now see them. But this assumption seems to me to be no explanation, for it leaves the case of the co-adaptations of organic beings to each other and to their physical conditions of life untouched and unexplained. It is therefore of the highest importance to gain a clear insight into the means of modification and co-adaptation. At the commencement of my observations, it seemed to me probable that a careful study of domesticated animals and of cultivated plants would offer the best chance of making out this obscure problem. Nor have I been disappointed. In this and in all other perplexing cases, I have invariably found that our knowledge, imperfect though it may be, of variation under domestication, afforded the best and safest clue. I may venture to express my conviction of the high value of such studies, although they have been very commonly neglected by naturalists. From these considerations, I shall devote the first chapter of this abstract to variation under domestication. We shall thus see that a large amount of hereditary modification is at least possible, and what is equally or more important, we shall see how great is the power of man in accumulating by his selection successive slight variations. I will then pass on to the variability of species in a state of nature, but I shall unfortunately be compelled to treat this subject far too briefly, as it can be treated properly only by giving long catalogues of facts. We shall, however, be enabled to discuss what circumstances are most favourable to variation. In the next chapter, the struggle for existence amongst all organic beings throughout the world, which inevitably follows from their high geometrical powers of increase, will be treated of. This is the doctrine of Malthus, applied to the whole animal and vegetable kingdoms. As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. This fundamental subject of natural selection will be treated at some length in the fourth chapter, and we shall then see how natural selection most inevitably causes much extinction of the less improved forms of life and induces what I have called divergence of character. In the next chapter, I shall discuss the complex and little known laws of variation and of correlation of growth. In the 4 succeeding chapters, the most apparent and gravest difficulties on the theory will be given. Namely, first, the difficulties of transitions, or in understanding how a simple being or a simple organ can be changed and perfected into a highly developed being or elaborately constructed organ. Secondly, the subject of instinct or the mental powers of animals. Thirdly, hybridism or the infertility of species and the fertility of varieties when intercrossed. And fourthly, the imperfection of the geological record. In the next chapter, I shall consider the geological succession of organic beings throughout time. In the 11th and 12th, their geographical distribution throughout space. In the 13th, their classification or mutual affinities, both when mature and in an embryonic condition. In the last chapter, I shall give a brief recapitulation of the whole work and a few concluding remarks. No one ought to feel surprise at much remaining as yet unexplained in regard to the origin of species and varieties, if he makes due allowance for our profound ignorance in regard to the mutual relations of all the beings which live around us. Who can explain why one species ranges widely and is very numerous, and why another allied species has a narrow range and is rare? Yet these relations are of the highest importance, for they determine the present welfare and, as I believe, the future success and modification of every inhabitant of this world. Still less do we know of the mutual relations of the innumerable inhabitants of the world during the many past geological epochs in its history. Although much remains obscure and will long remain obscure, I can entertain no doubt, after the most deliberate study and dispassionate judgment of which I am capable, that the view which most naturalists entertain, and which I formerly entertained, namely, that each species has been independently created, is erroneous. I am fully convinced that species are not immutable, but that those belonging to what are called the same genera are lineal descendants of some other and generally extinct species, in the same manner as the acknowledged varieties of any one species are the descendants of that species. Furthermore, I am convinced that natural selection has been the main but not exclusive means of modification. So that's going to be very exciting. I can almost feel the excitement of Darwin when he's writing this. I mean, he's really, put a lot of time into it, put his whole life into it, feels himself nearing a certain level of certainty after approaching the problem with so much, as he calls it, objectivity, dispassionate questioning. And another thing I liked about this is just thinking about all the things which were cloudy to him at the time that he didn't really know. These little moments at the end where he highlights the unknowns, the things that are still left to figure out for naturalists. While a lot of that has been tackled, but it's remarkable at the same time, at least with my limited knowledge, how much he seems to have gotten right despite those big clouds of unknown gaps in knowledge at the time. For example, I think he says not knowing at the time how variation could be generated mechanically inside an organism. Mutation, basically, I think he's talking about. And nowadays I think we've progressed so much in genetics, understanding how variation can occur through mutation, for example, and mechanically understanding that. And then also, how he describes some puzzlement as to how a simple organ could evolve into a more complex organ. And I think there's been a lot of work in that recently, in like epigenetics and stuff, how, you know, that could be mechanically understood to occur over large periods of time. So it's very interesting to put yourself in the shoes of people at the time, and how exciting such a theory must have been, considering it was still such a mystery and there remained mysteries, yet it was still a very attractive theory. So moving on to the next chapter then.